Now, moving from employment issues to poverty, a pleasure to have here Francisco Ferreira, who's senior advisor at the Development Research Group at the World Bank, and spent a whole life on researching poverty issues and its determinants. Looking at, well, one of the report's key findings, it reiterates that most of poverty is still found in rural areas, and that past experience has shown that poverty reduction accelerates where there's strong agricultural productivity grows, and then people migrate from rural to urban areas and find employ in non-farm activities as a major tendency. But the report also argues, well, that may be the trodden path, but moving forward things may have to be different because of the challenges that Louise also referred to. And particularly we should look much more at geographical aspects of rural-urban linkages and so on. And very often we look at poverty numbers at a global level and at the national level, but very rarely properly disaggregated. So would you agree that, as the report says, that we should strengthen rural-urban linkages and that this time has to be different? We should look more specifically at how these linkages come about and not just look at a general pattern rural-urban, but actually within urban distinguish different categories of cities and the vicinity of rural areas and agriculture markets to those areas. So in short, haven't we overlooked the territorial dimension of poverty?
Thank you. There we go. Can you hear me? Thank you, Rob. Yeah, so I really like the focus on this heterogeneity across the urban areas and the emphasis on small and medium-sized towns. Some of my own work in the past with collaborators like Peter Lanyau and Céline Ferreira, we wrote about the existence of a metropolitan bias in policymaking, you know, additional to the urban bias that Lipton and others have written about. The idea that not only is there a political economy bias in favor of urban areas in general, but within urban areas, there may well be, and there's quite a lot of evidence that there is in fact a bias in favor of the big cities, the capital cities, the metropolitan areas, to the detriment of smaller and medium-sized towns. And of course, these are the ones that, as the report notes, have this catchment areas and the capillarity that puts them in touch with farming areas and rural areas more generally. So we documented that poverty rates are typically higher in smaller towns than they are in large metropolitan areas, and the availability of services provided to people in these cities is less also in these smaller towns. So that does argue for paying attention to how that political economy equilibrium arises, try to redirect resources to these towns, and enhance then the linkages between these towns and the rural areas. That's particularly, I'm reminded of some data that I saw from the Afrobarometer some time ago, which suggested that the main determinants for people for migration decisions in Africa from the rural areas elsewhere were not actually the availability of jobs, but the availability of public services. Schools, electricity, water, healthcare. So, you know, that means that the availability of services in local towns rather than big cities can have a huge impact as well in terms of reshaping the migration map and the map of people as they make this transition from agriculture to other things. So, so that's one point that I wanted to make about that. The second point, though, is that I think the key question, and the report touches on this, but I'm not sure, and neither is it fair to ask that it have all the answers, but one question that I think remains for us is we've been talking for a long time about the importance of rural infrastructure and better linkages, right? Louise pointed to lots of work on rural roads. We know about the investment, importance of investment in rural electrification. So rural and rural to small city infrastructure is important. The question is, how do we design institutions and fiscal systems that generate those investments? You know, it's unlikely to come from central planning. It's unlikely that the right decisions about investment in rural infrastructure in India will be taken in Delhi, or in Nigeria will be taken in Abuja, right? I mean, so what are the optimal levels of decentralization? How do we ensure that decentralization isn't then captured by local elites? Work by lots of people like Pranab Bardhan, Dilip Mukherjee have worried about that. So you want to decentralize, but at the same time you want to decentralize in a way that is not captured by the local elites. These are difficult questions, you know. So I think there's a question of institutional design to generate the political economy equilibrium that shifts the investment towards these kinds of infrastructure investments that we want in these areas. That was a second point. I have two more points which are a little bit broader. One relates to the agro-industry question that you asked, Louise, and there I just want to say the report also does have some discussion of alternative models, and in particular the model of cooperatives of smallholders. And I think that's a very interesting one. I think we need to be concerned that the replacement of small holding subsistence agriculture, which has its productivity challenges and has a number of issues, but that the replacement of this by agro-industry isn't accompanied by the sort of wholesale loss of land ownership in very unfavorable terms. So, you know, the creation of a landless proletariat has fueled industrial revolutions in the past, as the report notes. It's not obvious that we want to replicate that now, particularly not in places like Africa, where there isn't an industrialization to then absorb them. And there's a lot of writing at the moment about these people migrating to cities, which are basically consumption cities, where most of the activity, as the report notes, is on informal sector services with very low productivity as well. So we need to think of a way in which farm scales and synergies for procuring inputs and for procuring extension and for managing the logistics of sales are obtained without replacing farmers by small farms entirely by large farms, which are more capital intensive and displace people at very rapid rates. And I think the idea of cooperatives of smallholders is an interesting one. I don't know that much about it myself, but I think it's an issue that I would like to hear more from Andrea on, or whether that's a sustainable model in some places. And my last point is just to say that when we talk about investment to support growth in rural areas, and when we talk about investment also in these linkages, one thing that I think is hugely important, and the report mentions it, but maybe not as much as I would have liked, is the investment in the human capital of the farmer. I think the challenge is a productivity challenge more generally, rather than just a farm productivity issue. And so I try to think about what we know about the quality of education delivery in rural China in the 1980s, before the big reforms of the late 80s, and the quality of the schools in sub-Saharan Africa today. And I suspect that that there was a very big difference, and that one advantage that the Chinese farmers had when the markets opened up was that they had more human capital. I don't really have that much evidence about the amount of learning that was going on in China in the 1980s, but we do know that the amount of learning that's going on in most schools in rural Africa and South Asia today is dismal, right? There was a recent World Bank report on this, but also lots of other reports that have documented that, in fact. And in some sense, I think all of the work we do on extension, on land tenure, on input use, needs to be complemented by a more general kind of emphasis on the human capital of the farmer, whether he or she remains a farmer or moves to other occupations. So that human capital nexus needs to be a very important part of this rural transformation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chico. I think a couple of important points. Basically what you're saying, we need to bring more of the good things of the cities to the rural areas, or also from the big cities to the smaller cities in form of infrastructure, services, but also human capital development in order for it to get more inclusive rural transformations. How to do that? We'll have some issues, particularly on the institutional side, but maybe also on the scale side, where it comes to how smallholder farmers can overcome their economies of scale problems.